Hi and welcome everybody to our 21st Open Clock Club. Sorry we're a minute or so late this evening. That was entirely my fault, of course. Faffing about trying to get too many things organized. Anyway, organized using the term very, very loosely, of course. So as always, really great to see you this evening. My bit of housekeeping first, remember that these sessions are recorded and they go on our How to Repair Pendulum Clocks Open Clock Club archive. So if you want to remain anonymous, then please keep your camera turned off. Again, as always, this what you see here, me basically, is about half of what goes on here. Please participate in the live chat. We get a lot of information out of that, and it's really great because in our very sort of modest way, we like to think we're building some kind of community. So please say hello to one another. I know many of you have been talking during the week on Facebook, which is great. I think we passed 200 or exceeded 200 members this week, which was brilliant. And we had a nice live stream on Thursday, which is on our live stream channel. And tonight we're going to get down to getting back to our escape wheel, which I think you can see on the screen here. And we're going to try and get our mainspring back in the barrel, and a third thing as well, which I've temporarily forgotten about. Oh yeah, that's the thing we're going to do first, this whole thing about suspension springs. So if you're new tonight, an extra special warm welcome. Please ask questions in the live chat. And if you haven't already, if you want to join our community about repairing pendulum clocks, we've got a few incredibly helpful members, and I say it every week now, but a super thank you to those people who have been helping with tips on repairing things and sharing tools and materials and all sorts of stuff. So massive thank you to you people. As always, you know who you are. What else has gone on this week? Oh, we had a slightly chaotic auction purchase. There was a kind of 1930s a fusee clock, and I thought that maybe I was the only person that hadn't seen it. So we bidded on this fusee clock. We didn't buy it, and we were the underbidder maybe, but we did buy a whole lot of other stuff, including, it's not a pendulum clock, but including a nice Seiko alarm clock with a musical box as an alarm. So at some point we'll be working on that. And today we live opposite charity shop, and of course the shops here in England have only just opened. I don't know what the situation is around the world, but only just opened last Monday. And I was sat here, or I would say sat here working, of course I wasn't actually working, and I could see there was like a 1960s Metamec mantle clock I didn't know it was a Metamec mantle clock in the window. So I thought, right, gotta, this is when I was in my dressing gown this morning, get out there and get this clock. And when I went across to the shop, regrettably somebody had taken out the earlier movement. So it could have been electro balance, which I think are incredible, or it could have been early quartz, but it had gone and there was a new quartz movement in it, which is a bit of a shame. So I didn't buy it, but what I did buy were these set of coasters. So clock coasters, what time does it say? It says 4 minutes past 5. So interesting bit of psychology there, because of course, when there's a whole thing about setting hands, sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a rant now, not talking about repairing clocks, but we'll get onto that in a minute. This whole psychology of setting the hands of a clock either at 10 to 2 or 10 past 10, which is a kind of smiley face, or the opposite, that kind of sad face. But I didn't know, did you know this top bit of non-information, that the Amazon logo designer's dad, I think, was it? Yeah. Dad, we think, was a clock person or clockmaker. And that swoosh, that smiley swoosh under the Amazon logo was inspired by that classic kind of smiley face clock dial. So there you go. We've got coasters. Right, on the screen is our escape wheel that we've been looking at and working on. We're going to come back to that, because we were asked a few weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks ago now, I talked about the pendulum or suspension on a long case clock or on a clock needing to be in line with the crutch, and this idea of the pendulum swinging in a clean plane. And somebody asked whether I could elaborate on that a bit. So let's get out of the way. Let's get that out of the way at the beginning. So I just need to share my screen. So what I'm talking about here, if we look at this long case clock movement, if you imagine the pendulum on a long case or tall case clock, but any clock really that's got a suspension spring, the pendulum, for it to work at its best, has to swing in what I call a clean arc. So it's planar, I suppose. Now, of course, a pendulum doesn't swing in a perfect arc of a circle because of the bending of the suspension spring. It is actually the point of rotation, the center of the arc is changing the whole time. However, if you imagine it swinging in a plane, if that plane is not planar and it's oscillating, that's going to cause you a problem. And what I've seen time and time again on clocks like this is that you can see here the backcock, the slot in this case, if I just find an engineer's square, the slot in this case, let's just have a look, is, as you can see there, it is not lined up, it's not perpendicular to the back plate of the movement. And that's not a problem. These backcocks were cast, and then the slot for the suspension spring was sewn by hand. So you sometimes see them actually more pronounced than this. So what do you do to make sure that the crutch, which is impulsing the pendulum, and the pendulum are in accord? Well, the answer is you've got to make the crutch line up with the slot in the backcock. Now, this is cast material, so it's not work hardened. So you might argue, well, Matthew, what I would do there is I would bend this. Now, the problem with bending things, of course, is you kind of move them away for how it's been. Unless you can see that the clock has been dropped or something and it's obviously bent off to one side, then I would leave it as it is. Now, this can look like it causes a problem, because if you see here, the crutch slot, which you can see down here, and the backcock slot are pretty much in line, and that is how it must be. Check, this is, if you've got a problem with the clock not running reliably, check that the crutch and the backcock slot are in line. Absolutely critical. If the backcock slot is at a bit of an angle and you make the crutch slot perpendicular to the plate, the clock is not going to be running properly. Because if you imagine, if we just get our paper, if this is our crutch slot, if this is our center line for our suspension spring, and here is therefore the top block of the pendulum, so that is this piece of material here. So this is the this way up. The pendulum rod comes in here. This is the top block of the pendulum, and this is the suspension spring. Those two, if the spring is straight, which of course you don't always know that it is straight, but let's say it is, are in line. If the crutch, and we'll draw that in green because we love a bit of color coding, the crutch slot, let's just draw it like that. Like that, must be, for the clock to run well, the pendulum to swing in a clean arc, must be parallel with that. If you make the crutch slot perpendicular with a plate and the backcock slot isn't, then what will happen is this crutch slot here, it'll be at an angle relative to the top block. So the pendulum is going to be impulsed here when it's going in that direction, and yeah, an impulse here when it's going in that direction, which will cause the pendulum to wobble, basically. So if you've got a clock where the pendulum's wobbling, and that's either causing a problem with loss of energy, or it's unreliable to the point sometimes that the pendulum can actually touch the backboard of the clock. Now, the problem with this is, if you do it this way, the clock will run well. Believe me, it's on my top 10 list of things that can destroy your kind of business and reputation. Make sure that those two things are in line. The problem with that is, of course, is sometimes the pendulum will not be swinging parallel to the backboard of the clock. That clock case, that is not the overriding kind of priority here. Our priority is that the clock runs. So sometimes you'll see the two swinging at an angle. Also with this, if you imagine that like in this case of this clock here, the slot is sawn at an angle to the backboard, to the back plate of the movement. The crutch, this is the line that the top block's taking, and let's think about this. This is going to be the line that the crutch is taking, and that is fine as long as they're parallel. It's not ideal, obviously. If you were designing a new clock, you wouldn't make it like that, but these things are hundreds of years old. What, of course, needs to happen in this scenario is that the crutch slot needs to be as parallel as possible, and it needs this gap at the side. The crutch slot and the top block of the pendulum rod must not be a tight fit. They can be very, very, very close, but there must be shake or a little bit of movement between the two. If we actually just look at this one here, we can see that on one side of this is obviously old, it's been refinished, but on one side of the top block, there's been a bit of material soldered on. So if you get that, talking about auction houses, I'm not sure we should really bash auction houses, but that is one place where pendulums and driving weights from clocks can get mixed up. And those of you that collect clocks will have had this situation where either, let's just have a look at this, the top block is really sloppy in here, like this, or it's too tight and it doesn't fit in at all. Obviously, if it's too tight, then you're probably going to have to file it down. But if it's sloppy like this, what you can do is you can soft solder a piece of material on the side to take up that that wear or that difference, if you like. But the important thing is that ideally this slot is parallel. It doesn't bind at all. Now, the reason it's important that it doesn't bind is that if you think about what's going on here, let's just get rid of that incredible drawing. So new beginners, as always, we're kind of cracking on with things. So please do bear with us. In the live chat again, please ask any questions. Happy to go over things and explain what the name of things are. We've got a question. Yep, all right, okay, yeah. What's the question?
In David's cuckoo clock, it wasn't the suspension spring, but it was the rod to which it connects, which was not square to the clock face, it was causing the pendulum to wobble.
Right.
I think he thinks that's what was causing the clock to stop. He bent the rod slightly.
Yeah, I mean, the way to analyze this is to first put the pendulum on. So if you imagine we hang the suspension spring on here, just imagine we put that on there without the crutch in, and just put the movement, in this case on the seat board, but if it's a wall clock, screw it to the case or whatever it is, and start the pendulum. This is if you've got a wobbling pendulum situation, and it can absolutely drive you bonkers. Put the pendulum on without the crutch there at all and start it swinging, and it'll swing for ages and ages. And that at least then eliminates the suspension spring. If the pendulum's wobbling without any interference from the crutch, then typically it's the suspension spring that's a problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Then you can introduce the crutch, as you said, Dave, and then eliminate that if it's that that's causing the problem. But it can be really, really difficult to analyze the problem with this wobbling pendulum, because what tends to happen is you'll start the thing swinging and then that oscillation, that secondary kind of oscillation, builds up over time. So yeah, why do modern some kind of clocks have a lot of play in there? And I think it's just that you can put the thing on the wall and it's going to run. We talked about our Smith-Enfield clock. Of course, we talk about that the whole time. We've got our amazing book on the Smith-Enfield clock up there. And we think that they overdrive those clocks, because what they want is, let's say you buy a clock from a retail jeweler, there's no clockmaker involved, you take it home, you put it on the mantelpiece, or in the case of a cuckoo clock, you hang it on the wall. The manufacturer doesn't really care about the longevity of the clock. What they want is it to run and somebody to be happy. So in the case of the Smith-Enfield, they pretty massively overdrive those movements. And I think that's probably related to the question about the cuckoo clock slot as well, that if you've got a bit more slop in there, a bit more sort of side play, that leaves you a bit more kind of latitude for setting the thing up maybe. Anyway, that's my on the hoof kind of thinking about that. But if that's a wire slot, so just a bit of bent round wire, there's nothing at all to stop you closing that up. And I think what you'll find if you close up the slot is then the amplitude will increase as well. No, bending the rod. This when you're talking about you mean the pendulum rod. Both the pendulum rod and the crutch on this kind of clock are soft. They're not hardened. In fact, the crutch is designed to be bent to get the clock in beat on a long case clock like this. Is acceptable suspension? Right, okay. Yeah, so we're on to our second part of this really important question. So no, this part, the crutch, is designed to be bent to put the clock in beat. In beat is the evenness or the equal duration between ticks, or between tick and tock. When a clock is described as being in beat, the duration between it going tick and tock, tick and tock is the same. And in order to adjust that on a long case clock or tall case clock like this, you actually, let's just move that out of the way, you actually bend the crutch without putting too much strain on the pivot. You do something like that. You can see it bends ever so easily. Suspension spring. Or the actual pendulum rod. You don't normally need to bend the pendulum rod. If you are bending the pendulum rod, then maybe it's a situation where the pallets, like on a Smith-Enfield clock, can be moved in relation to the pallet arbor, which is causing you a problem. So I would look at that first. Pendulum rod should be straight. This is the bit that you would bend, although the pendulum rods are normally soft iron anyway. So you put the pendulum on, get it swinging without the crutch there, without the connecting piece, and check that that's right first. If that's wobbling, then you know where your problem lies. It's somewhere in the suspension spring. If it's fine, and then you add the crutch, then you've got a problem with the relationship between the crutch slot or the loop or whatever it is and the pendulum rod. If you've got a problem in the first instance with the pendulum swinging on its own, then there's a really critical point to do with this kind of clock. And we mention it in our book. Did I mention the book before? Oh, by the way, we've sold some books this week, so thank you very much. You will notice that our lights and electricity are on today, which is really cool, and it's all because of you. In fact, it's probably a bit dark. There we are. We've got some, if you can see that, I've got some fairy lights. Yeah, cool. Right, okay, so thinking about the pendulum rod, about the suspension, sorry. So we look at this way for beginners again. This component that fixes to the back of the movement frame. So to the back of the back plate is called the back cock, or the pendulum. This is the pendulum support part of the back cock. In this case, the back cock, got a pointy stick somewhere. In this case, the back cock has got a dual function. It supports the pendulum, and also it holds the bearing for the pallet arbor pivot as well. That's not always the case. Sometimes they're separate components. Interestingly, he says, I was thinking about this the other night, as you do, if we were looking at the pendulum spring slot being perpendicular to the frame, but could you repeat what you said about checking pallets? What I said last week. Right, okay. Could I repeat what I said about checking pallets? What part of checking the pallets? Was that today or was that last week? Today. What did I say? Of course, I'm really happy to repeat. Was it about it being in beat? Sorry, if you asked that question, could you just elaborate a little bit more? Because I've already forgotten what I said about checking the pallets. Interesting point here. Have we got any metallurgists? Sorry? Oh, right. Okay, about bending the rod. Thank you. Yeah. So looking around for clock parts in trays. On this clock, we'll see a bit later when we get talking about our escape wheel again, the pallets, so the component that interacts with the escape wheel, transferring energy from the escape wheel and the train to the oscillator, a pendulum in this case, are fixed permanently to their axle, the pallet arbor. They're riveted and soldered on. So you can't change that relationship. But in a lot of other clocks, like this Smith-Enfield clock, forget this piece, by the way, that's something I added for one of our many, many demonstrations. The crutch, which is this bit, so this is on a 1950s, let's say, mid-20th century mantle clock. This component and this component are the same thing. They do the same job of transferring energy to the pendulum. But you can see here that I've just demonstrated that on that tall case clock, the crutch is designed to be bent to put the clock in beat, to get the ticking even, if you like. Here, it's not. It's a kind of sheet of plate of material. You can't, well, you could bend it, but it would take a heck of a lot of force. The way you set this in beat is that there's a relationship between the pallet arbor, here with our pallets on, and the crutch. So you can kind of set the coarse adjustment when you assemble it with a screw here, but then you can set finer adjustment, because if you look at this, there's a clever clutch inside here, a friction tight fitting. And if we look, this is in line now, and you can move it to one side, and that changes the relative position of the pallets and the pendulum. So this action is the same thing effectively as bending the crutch. So I would say if you get to the position where you have to bend the pendulum rod, then you should really stop and think, is there a problem with the relationship between the crutch and the pallets? You shouldn't normally have to bend the pendulum rod. I don't know much about sort of later clocks really. So if there's anybody out there, particularly somebody who deals with a lot of American clocks, because I don't know much about them either, then please let us know in the live chat. That's wrong, Matthew. You do actually normally bend the pendulum rod. I would say you don't. You normally leave it straight. So yeah, don't bend the pendulum rod unless, as always, you've got really good evidence that it's been bent before. So the second part of the question about the suspension spring, I'm just going to note, I was thinking, as I said, I was thinking about this the other night, that I'm convinced-ish that these components creep, the metal creeps. You always see, or often see, the back cock of a pendulum like this that's bent down. I don't think they're bent And again, if any metallurgists in the audience say, no, Matthew, that's total rubbish, the metal doesn't creep. But I think it's got the pendulum hung on it, which is pretty heavy. And this is cast, remember, it's not hardened material. We can see here that it's not at all perpendicular with the frame. And I was thinking about my theory. I thought, shall I mention my theory? And I thought, well, if it was that they just weren't fitted perpendicular in the first place, because it doesn't matter, you would get some that were pointing up and some that were pointing down and some that were perpendicular. And time after time after time, you see them where they're down. So I presume the metal creeps over time. Is that possible? Anyway, however, the important thing as far as our wobbling pendulum goes, that causes a problem with typekeeping or reliability here, is the relationship between the pendulum and the movement. The pendulum must be able to hang vertically under the influence of gravity. If it can't, you're going to have a problem. And this is something, again, did I mention that we wrote a book about Smith's Enfield clocks? This is something we discovered. I got a clock, a Bakelite Enfield, from the cock mount is tapered. Yeah, the back cock is cast and it's tapered. That could be in this case, it certainly is. This back cock here is a casting. So yes, it's tapered. So what we're saying that this, it is tapered, but and this is tapered here. I'm not convinced that that's the reason why they bend down, but maybe it is. So if you've got long case clocks or tall case clocks out there, then please have a look and let us know on Facebook whether you agree or disagree with my half-baked theory. So what's really important here, irrespective, remember this is a 200-year-old clock. Oh, by the way, beginners, I always try and remember to say, normally I'd wear gloves when I'm handling clocks for all parts of the process, but I don't here because it's just like almost impossible taking them on, taking them off, getting them caught on things. So that's the reason why I'm handling with fingers. This is a 200-year-old clock sat on a 200-year-old bit of wood in a 200-year-old clock case. There is zero guarantee that any of that is going to be square or upright or so on. People often get a spirit level out when trying to level up the thing, which can be useful, but probably is leading you down the garden path, as they say. What's really important, irrespective of whether this is vertical, is that the pendulum backcock can, the suspension spring, sorry, can assume a vertical. So it's under the influence of gravity. And I actually think this is probably, yeah, I don't know. This could be a made suspension spring top, but it could be one of those that you just buy from a material supplier. The clock used to stop till I bent the rod and closed the crutch. Right, okay, just another question that's coming about the crutch. Yeah, if the gap in the crutch, between the crutch and the spring is, the pendulum top block, sorry, is too big, so we're talking about, put it in the wrong way up, but if there's too much slop here, too much play, then yeah, the clock will stop because the clock's moving the crutch and it's not impulsing the pendulum. So that's a good point. That gap wants to be as reasonably small as possible, but there must be a gap there. And put oil on both sides as well. Put thick oil on like Mobius D5. And I like to think it acts as a viscous coupling, but whether it does or not, it actually just quietens the whole thing down as well. So oil that little joint, but there must be a gap there. So you can see here, this top block of the suspension spring is semicircular. Sometimes they're round, sometimes they're semicircular. This, as much as it's not the most elegant design, is absolutely the best way of doing this. So we can see the backcock pendulum support has got a square notch in it. Do not, if you're making this new or replacing a suspension spring, don't be tempted to make a square block that fits in the top, because it won't work. The chances of that and that being, well, you can see here, if we made that block, just If we made that block perpendicular to the backcock, there is no way that the suspension spring is going to hang vertical. So what you'll find is it's like this, and then the suspension spring is effectively working at, well, an infinite number, but 2 radiuses, and it'll wobble and it'll bend and it won't be happy. You see all sorts of shapes in the backcock. So what we've got there is this, but you also see a crazy one that's like this, and you see a semicircle like this. Yeah, I don't know about the pendulum support deforming, but it's what I would call creep in metals, but I'm not a metallurgist. But I just think over 200 years that bit of metal bends down, but maybe not. I'll leave that with you people to do some research. So irrespective of whatever shape, I guess some of you have maybe got or worked on 17th century clocks or 18th century clocks, have seen this design of backcock. If you've got a suspension spring that's extant, exists, and it's got a triangular top on it, then of course, what you do, you probably have to leave it unless it's really actively causing a problem. But if you're replacing the top block of the suspension spring, then irrespective of what the shape is, you make that either round or semicircular. That is the way to make the pendulum hang straight down. The second part of this, there are many parts to this, is this joint here. So again, sorry, there's a lot to kind of take in here, but normally the pendulum rod comes in like this. This is your pendulum rod here. My hand is a pendulum bob screwed into the bottom of there. So it's really important that this joint is also free. If you imagine there's any reluctance in this area for it not to hang straight, this must also be articulated to hang straight as well. And if you're replacing a suspension spring, because they often get broken or bent beyond repair, then please do not rivet this pin in here. Make the pin a really good fit in the hole and draw file it, tap it in, and then finish it flush or make it the right length, in fact, for the block. You don't have to rivet it over. Riveting it over just makes it next to impossible for the next person to get out. And it means often that this gets split. So just push in a draw filed, really good fit taper pin. It will not drop out as long as it's a really good fit. Then the next person can just get it out easily without having to drill or use their non-existent staking set. Right, okay, let's just look at our Smith-Enfield problem that we came across here. So we've got a slightly different setup here, but for beginners, again, this component, backcock and pendulum support with the bearing, you can see there, look, pretty much exactly the same thing. The big difference is that this is machine made and that's nominally kind of handmade. But the same idea, other than you can see this has got a wider slot in it because it's not the suspension spring that fits in there, it's the actual whole component with the top block included. And so this is, suspension springs get broken a lot, and obviously the manufacturer said, this is going to be much easier than messing about with clockmakers making things. We'll just make the parts broadly standardized, they're not standardized, and sort of interchangeable. So for these Smith-Enfield clocks, pretty much you can get one of these springs, you can fit it in there, the backcock, and it's absolutely fine. However, on the early or the original clocks, almost everyone I've seen that I think has got its original suspension spring, there is a problem. I inherited a Bakelite version of this. I was going to start the story, wasn't I? And the person who'd had it said that clock never kept really good time. And I said, I bet I know why that is. And the reason is because this fit here is just fractionally too tight. So these don't have a particularly heavy pendulum, and this is quite tight in here. And what happens is when you regulate the clock or fit the pendulum bob, sometimes the spring stays like that, or like that, in fact, where it's even tighter in the slot. You can see it's quite tight, and it doesn't assume the vertical, so the clock doesn't keep time for two reasons. Obviously, the pendulum isn't the same effective length, it's ever so fractionally shorter, but more importantly, you can imagine that this thing is trying to bend across here while it's working. So again, it's going to induce that wobble, which is going to cause all sorts of problem with timekeeping. So as conservative as we are in our sort of approach, or try and be, we wouldn't normally start filing a component, which was perfectly reasonable. But what we do say here, you can see how this is manufactured. It's punched. So on one side, on this side, look, it's kind of pushed in. On this side, it's been pushed out. And I presume, I don't know, in the factory, they had this thing all to a certain tolerance, but the actual process of making the components meant that the two ended up too tight. So what we suggest is checking that there isn't a burr on the inside of this component where it's been drilled through. And you would do that. I can find one.
It's addresses with a hammer.
Right, okay, this is what? So, but just checking that there's no burr on the inside of that back cock slot, which has got a little escapement file here, and just holding it in the hand, it's as simple as that and that on the other side, and that has cleared away that burr. And with the suspension spring top block, then I would just get a finish file like this, and oh dear, the files had a bit of abuse. Oh dear, poor thing, poor thing. And just hold the top block on your finger, and again, a little bit of material removal. These processes are a cost-benefit exercise. I don't, as a principle, want to remove any material, but without that, this clock is not going to perform reliably. And you just continue that process until you've removed enough material that the weight of the pendulum will always make the suspension spring assume, or the pendulum assume, a vertical position. So hopefully that's expanded that question. The opposite of this, where it's too tight, is it's too slack, which is also a death for the operation of the clock. The suspension spring in the top block, or whatever it is, the suspension spring top block in the slot needs to be a good fit. If it's wobbling about, it will cause you a problem. And that, I probably said this before on Open Clock Club, but I had one of my kind of most mind-bending returns to clocks that I just maybe took 3-4 times to get right. And that was a French clock called a four glass. So this is a 19th century French clock, pretty kind of nice, but pretty regular clock. And it had one of those mock, are they mock? No, they're not mock, are they? The mercury pendulum with 2 jars. You might have seen them. Some of you maybe have one. And at the top of that pendulum is a double hook, which hooks onto the suspension spring. So rather unlike this, maybe if we have a comfort break, I can find one to show you. But anyway, the point is that those 2 hooks on the top of the pendulum hook onto the bottom of the suspension spring. And in this case, however it happened, I don't know, one of them had got bent in a bit. So it was just like this the whole time. And that was causing the thing to wobble, and it drove me bonkers trying to figure it out. The minute I saw it, I kind of went, right, I bent it back, and problem sorted. So don't put up with wobbling pendulums. You don't have to do. Is there another question there? No, okay. Right, okay, so how are we doing? Let's just have a minute's break, and then we will get back to our escape wheel. We'll come back at 42. We'll come back at 44, so literally like 1 minute. Okay. Unmute. Welcome back, everybody. A bit of a short break, but there you go. Out's better than out, as they say in Yorkshire, apparently. Before we just move back to our escape wheel, a question about lubrication, and it's a good question. And as always, I got no idea about the answer, but this does tie into one of my big kind of bugbears about regular servicing of clocks. If you're working, when you begin with your How to Repair Pendulum Clocks Volume 1 book, we strongly advise, and I get reinforcement of this every week, people who repair clocks, you know, a neighbor or a friend said, oh, I heard you're starting with clocks. So they take it on, causes a nightmare. Do not repair clocks you don't own, sorry, until you're confident. Otherwise, you just then run into problems. So that's my #1 top tip, like ever. But if you're repairing for customers, they say, how often should we have this clock serviced? And I know some people say, again, you can put it in a live chat, every 5 years, every year, every 10 years, whatever. I never say that because there are so many variables. It really depends on the dust tightness of the case. It depends on the position of the clock within the building. For instance, it might be in a room that's normally kind of closed off, where there isn't a lot of moving air. It could be in a stairwell where there's a lot of exchange of air the whole time. There might be inorganic material outside, like a gravel drive. There's lots of dust coming in, all sorts of things. So I'd say the key thing there is regular inspection rather than regular overhauling. We clockmakers tend to have more work than we can deal with, luckily, which is brilliant. So it's not like we have to kind of go out and ask for a lot of work. Oh, that's my broad experience, if anyway, luckily. But so I don't ever say, what I would say is I'll come back, have a look, maybe take the hands and the dial off and look at the state of the lubrication to see whether it looks black or green or it's dried up or evaporated. And yes, sometimes I would be okay with adding a bit of oil if the oil has evaporated and it still looks reasonably clean. Obviously, you can only do that maybe once or twice before you have to completely disassemble the clock. But I would try and do that every year, 18 months, something like that. But the question is, when your lubrication or the oil you've bought from Mobius, for instance, has got to the expiry date here on the syringe in this case, or on the canister, what does this say? So this expires 2/26. This grease expires 11/26. When that expires, when that expires, do you have to clean the clock again? It's a really good question. And I think the answer to this is that with Mobius, they don't make these lubricants for clocks, they make them for watches. The watch industry is a multi-million billion Swiss franc dollar industry, and clocks are not, basically. So one thing is write to Mobius and ask them, and I'm sure they'll say that yes, once that you need to disassemble and clean the object. As far as a clock is concerned, so this is brand new this week. I'm going to do some contracting work on Monday and Tuesday, which you can catch up with on Twitter and things. And so 2021, 2, 3, 4, 5, mental math. So it's 5 years. Okay. The object I'm going to work on hasn't been disassembled and cleaned for more than 10 years. So well overdue. The question is, I mean, as a very, don't hold me to it, you didn't hear it from me, but as a very, very broad sort of rule, I would think if a clock has been running non-stop for 5 years, even in a pretty clean environment, clock cases are not, you know, hermetically sealed. You're going to want to disassemble, wash, and replace the lubricant. Good question for Mobius, but I think they'll say yes. And also, it really relates to watches, where you've got a very, very different environment. You've got dual bearings, you've got a sealed-ish case. They're not clocks. And there's a good argument here, I think, for using older style kind of natural lubricants, because they naturally go sticky and stop the clock anyway, which means you've got to take it apart. How do you make, another question, how do you make the crutch slot narrower? You sometimes see them kind of squeezed in. Don't do that, because it's not going to be parallel. In this case, we've soft soldered a piece of extra material on there. So you want to, as a principle, always add material rather than taking it away, because at least somebody can see what you've done. And what was that question, Frank? I'll just, questions are coming thick and fast today. Yeah, we've got a thing. There's maybe we'll come back to lubrication next week, because there's some really great questions there. And I know it's one of those subjects that really animates people. Some people say it doesn't matter, just put old, you know, not old engine oil, but engine oil in springs, for instance, which I don't personally like because it smells funny. And some people say use Mobius stuff. For me, this stuff seems quite expensive, but it, you know, if I throw this, what's left of it, away after 5 years, in the big makeup of things, it is not expensive. So springs that clunk, we're going to refit our spring. We're not going to get it done today. We're going to run out of time. But I've found with the liquid spray grease that I use, it really reduces that sort of stick slip thing where you'll be listening, sat in the living room, the clock will suddenly go brrr, and the spring slips. I find that a lot with modern springs where they're very finely finished. But in this case, we're talking about a 200-year-old spring. And I would imagine it's because the lubricant is too thick. I imagine it might only be oil and could be completely wrong there. But let's just talk about that a bit more next week. Again, it's in our book. So in the last 10 minutes, if you want to come back to oils, again, sorry, sounds totally lame. I'm not a specialist on this. We need to find somebody. Yeah, motorcycle chain lube, which is what I use on mainsprings, basically. I found it really good. Let's talk about oil maybe next week when I've been, yeah, let's do that, because I'll have spent Monday and Tuesday oiling the complicated clock. So our wheel, and I've drawn on the back of my drawing now, you remember, if you were here the last couple of weeks, we've got an escape wheel here with what we think are rogue teeth. And I'm dragging this out a bit because there's a lot to be said about it, but also because, you know, it's really central. Every clock, most clocks have got an escape wheel that we work on, and often those teeth get damaged and we've got the thing running in and out of beat. So we are laboring it a bit, but we're here to kind of learn and exchange information. So here's our wheel. It's got 30 teeth. It's about 200 years old. It's from a 30-hour duration tall case clock. I think it's a 3-wheel train clock. Yes, it is. So it's got a great wheel. an intermediate wheel, and an escape wheel. So as you're looking at the front of the clock, it rotates counterclockwise. So we really know that this wheel is mounted eccentrically, and I will knock it off the collet and have a look at that. But just some quick top tips in our last 10 minutes to kind of analyze the problems with an escape wheel. So last week, I think we put it in the depthing tool or in the lathe just to see what that run out was. And there is run out or eccentricity, if you like. And then I made, where is it here, a little gauge or even a gauge that fits between the teeth of wheels and the teeth of the wheel, yeah. And so we can find out any rogue teeth. So this is incredibly useful little technique. So that'll kind of tell you one tooth to the other, but there's a bigger kind of problem there, because in the escapement, of course, one tooth doesn't communicate with the tooth that's next to it. It communicates with one, I use that word communicate, like it's got some consciousness. That's another a whole lifetime, I think, discussing that. With a tooth that's like always half a tooth away, so it's n.5 teeth, might be 6.5 or 7.5 teeth away. So I've done a little survey here. So that'll tell you one tooth to the next, which is reasonably useful. And then I made up a little gauge earlier. And what this will show are short and long teeth. This took me about 3 minutes to make. It's not super neat, but looking under an eyeglass, you can see where there are short and long teeth. So in the last few minutes, I'll just discuss, then honest, I won't come back to it again. This is the last time we're going to talk about it. And excuse the fact that I drew on the back of my beautifully prepared photograph here. I've numbered the teeth. I hope you can, let's just go in there. I've numbered the teeth counterclockwise. Let's get a pencil. So starting at 1, and again, on my soapbox, which I do all the time, I apologize, you don't need to mark clock components. They are already marked. You just have to look closer. So my advice would be, don't put Sharpie pen on them. It can leave a mark, and don't scratch them. That's my thing. So here we've got a tooth with a stain on it, look. So there's our number 1 tooth. And then we've moved counterclockwise. There are 30 teeth. And let's just, because we haven't got time to put the clock back together again, let's say that the pallets are embracing 7.5 teeth. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get a pair of scissors and some paper. Oh, look what we've got here. Not going to be big enough. Just about big enough. So we've got, let's just start here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and to there. Need a bigger bit of paper. So let's take our first tooth here. Remember, the wheel is turning counterclockwise as we're looking at it. And this tooth in our theoretical model has just landed on the entry pallet. We talked about entry and exit pallet last week and maybe before. Again, it's kind of quite difficult to find things. People have said, can you explain again? I'm happy to explain again, but it might be next week now. So that tooth, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5. So that's just landed on the entry pallet. So that's like that, isn't it? And this one is just leaving the exit pallet. This is using every part of my brain here. So there are our pallets. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a little jig here like this. And what this will enable us to do is to survey the wheel. And it's kind of important, it takes a bit of getting your head around, but there we are. These are our slightly crazily formed pallets. But what we've got, and this is to make the point that in this situation, this tooth here, tooth number 1, we're going to call it, and this tooth here are in communication. They're not active teeth at the same time. There's only ever one active tooth. But if this one is bent in this direction, for instance, then that's going to hit the entry pallet sooner than the other teeth will. So that's like reducing drop. Likewise, if it's bent this way, it's going to increase drop. Likewise, if this one is bent this way, this one is going to be, that's also going to increase external drop. And if this one's bent this way, it's going to decrease into external drop. So you can see that analyzing the sort of health of this wheel, it's not like complicated, but it is something that you need to get your head round. So in this instance, with this pair of pallets I've just made with a bit of paper, that tooth and that tooth are in a relationship when it comes to external drop. So that's dropped the whole way round there. But remember, that's not the end of it, because as the clock goes tick, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, and we get all the way around here, this tooth that's our number 1 tooth is now in a relationship with this tooth here. Does that make sense? So there's that constantly changing pattern of the tooth that's ahead on internal drop, and the tooth that's ahead on external drop, and the tooth that's behind on internal drop. So this can be, just going back to our gauge, which is here, and our wheel, you might go round like this and say, all right, then this tooth here is bent forward a bit, or it's bent back a bit, or it's a bit short, or it's a bit long. And then my point of demonstrating this is to say that it's not actually relating to the tooth that's next to it. It's relating to one that's round here and one that's round here at the same time. All right, yeah, if the question is, are the teeth at 90 degrees to one another? It's purely arbitrary, really. If here we've got a 30-tooth escape wheel, and I've just drawn it, I think I've drawn it, I'll have to check later, that the pallets are embracing 7.5 teeth. So they're embracing a quarter of the wheel. So in this case, yes, they are, but they're not always like that. You get something called a tic-tac escapement, where the pallets are embracing far fewer teeth. I think on the end field, there are 44 teeth and they embrace 6.5. And then there are some deadbeat escapements where they embrace more. So it's just an example here, but yes, they do in this case, and because it's easy to draw like that. So you can see there that in analyzing this wheel, what I would do if this were, well, not that it's an important wheel, it's just an escape wheel. We're trying to get to the problem of rogue teeth. Do a drawing like this, number all the teeth, go around with your gauge, go around with your little gauge to see if you've got long or short teeth. You hold this up to the light. It's quite easy to see, actually. And then you've got to make a decision as to what you do, whether you top the wheel, which is shortening some of the teeth, or in this case, we know that, I will run out of time, we know that actually we're not going to fiddle with individual teeth, because there's a bigger problem in the sense that the wheel is actually mounted eccentrically. So for half the wheel, we've got drop, and for the other half of the wheel, we haven't got drop. Before I disappear, and one thing that I've never mentioned, I don't think, in all these times we've been talking about escapements, because they're all driving us crazy, is land. So, okay. We know, or we believe, or we understand, or we've read in the book, that an escapement like this anyway, needs drop to operate. You can't have an escapement with zero drop. But I realized I never talked about land. And what land is if you look at any one of these teeth, like this, for instance, there's a flat bit on top. Oops. That is land. And have we spoke about topping teeth? No, we haven't spoken about topping teeth yet. If we want to speak about topping teeth, then put it in the live chat really quickly and we'll come back to it after we've spoken about oiling a bit next week. And the point about land is when you make a clock, if you've made a clock out there, you have to have land on your escape wheel. Even if you look at something like a regulator or a marine chronometer, it's got really fine teeth, you have to have a flat. But if you imagine if the tooth just came to a point like that, it would be, well, it would be completely weak and it would just bend or wear down or something. So you've got to have a little flat bit. But if you imagine, again, sorry I'm running over, I'll shut up in a minute. If you imagine your tooth, your palate, sorry. So here's our palate. The tooth has got to move an absolute minimum of that value for it to escape. Otherwise, the palate's just going to land back on here and it's going to hit on the top. We've got another question. I can't see it. I can't see the question, frankly. Moved up and down. So land is something I haven't mentioned. I'm sorry about that. Completely sort of overlooked it. And what you'll find on older escape wheels is that the lands tend to be quite big. So my point is, don't go chasing drop. There's an expression that John and I sometimes have a bit of a laugh about, where some people say, ooh, look at the drop on that, like it's sort of some kind of curse. It's not. If you've got an old clock and you've minimized the drops, that's really useful. But don't go chasing drop, because you'll end up recutting wheels, topping wheels, and chasing. And these are historic objects. So land is something I never mentioned. And you can see the land there, look, the little kind of flat bits on the top of the teeth. They're actually quite big in some cases. This is an old wheel. But your drop is always going to be at least as big as the land. It can never be any smaller than that, as you can see here from that amazing drawing. So a lot we've kind of covered there. Hopefully that's got the question answered about the suspension spring. Don't put up with wobbly pendulums. They can be resolved. And we've made a bit of progress on our wheel, which we'll get off the colic next week. We'll talk about oiling if you want to talk about oiling, although I don't know much about it from a technical perspective. All I can say is what I've used for the past 25 years or whatever it is now. I've been fixing clocks like this. I have a very straightforward regime for it, but would love to know what you think. And if any of you know a tribologist, a specialist in lubrication for oils for this kind of mechanism, then please let me know, because it would be great to get them on here to tell us what they think as well. So, wow, grab a breath. We've got lots and lots and lots and lots of live chat for us to go through. Thank you very much for that. We'll see you in the week on Facebook. Probably see you on Thursday, all being well, for our live stream where we're making a click spring for a long case clock. I'll be on Twitter a bit on Monday and Tuesday because I'm on contract. And thanks to the Facebook people. Most importantly, thanks to Open Clock Club team here who have been grafting away on the live chat. Keep safe, everybody, and we will see you next week. Thanks very much and goodbye. I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes so you can all say goodbye.